Welcome to WebLizard Cert Lab. This is AZ-104, Azure Administrator Long-Form Practice Exam Part 2. You are about to work through 50 Microsoft-style administrator scenarios. The goal is not just to memorize an answer letter. The goal is to learn the operational clue that points to the right Azure service, scope, or configuration. Here is how to use this video. Read the scenario, listen for the constraint, then commit to an answer before the reveal. After the question is read, you will get a 3-second silent timer. Pause there if you need more time. Then resume for the answer, the explanation, and the exam clue. If you miss one, do not treat it as failure. Treat it as a study map. Question 1. Pick one of 4. You are an Azure administrator for Contoso. A new operations team will grow from 12 users to more than 200 users over the next quarter. Every operations user must receive the same Microsoft 365 product license automatically when they join the team, and the license must be removed automatically when they leave the team. You need to minimize ongoing administrative work. What should you do? Option A. Assign the product license directly to each operations user from the Microsoft 365 Admin Center as each user is onboarded. Option B. Create an Azure RBAC role assignment for the operations team at the subscription scope. Option C. Create a Microsoft Entra security group for the operations team and assign the product license to the group. Option D. Create a Microsoft 365 group for collaboration and tell users to request the license from the group owner when they need it. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Create a Microsoft Entra security group for the operations team and assign the product license to the group. Microsoft Entra group-based licensing lets an administrator assign one or more product licenses to a group. Users who join the license group receive the license automatically, and users who leave the group have the license removed. That matches the requirement for automatic onboarding and offboarding with minimal ongoing administrative work. Exam clue. The phrases automatically when they join, removed automatically when they leave, and minimize ongoing administrative work point to group-based licensing, not direct user assignment or Azure RBAC. Question 2. Pick one of 4. You are creating a new Azure storage account for an internal application that stores JSON configuration files and small diagnostic exports. The workload does not require SSD-backed premium performance. The data must remain in the primary Azure region, but it must stay available if a single availability zone in that region becomes unavailable. You need to choose the lowest cost storage account configuration that satisfies these requirements. Which configuration should you use? Option A. Standard General Purpose V2 storage account with Geo-Redundant Storage, GRS. Option B. Standard General Purpose V2 storage account with Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS. Option C. Premium Block Blob Storage account with Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS. Option D. Standard General Purpose V2 storage account with Locally Redundant Storage, LRS. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is B. Standard General Purpose V2 storage account with Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS. A standard General Purpose V2 storage account is appropriate for general Azure storage workloads that do not need premium performance. ZRS synchronously copies data across availability zones in the primary region, so it addresses a zonal outage while keeping the data in that region. This satisfies the availability and regional requirements without paying for premium storage or geo-replication. Exam clue. Separate 3 requirements: performance tier, regional boundary, and outage scope. No premium performance points to standard. Single availability zone points to ZRS. Remain in the primary region rules out GRS/GZRS. Question 3. Pick one of 4. You need to deploy a new Azure virtual machine named VM App01 for an internal application. The VM must run Windows Server 2022, use the standard _D4S _V5 size, connect to the existing subnet named App Subnet in VNet-prod, and use Azure Managed OS and data disks, so your team does not manage storage accounts for the disks. The VM must not be reachable directly from the internet. Which deployment configuration should you choose? Option A. Create VM-App01 with the Windows Server 2022 image, standard _D4S _V5 size, managed disks, and a NIC connected to the default subnet with a public IP address for administration. Option B. Create VM-App01 with the Windows Server 2022 image, standard _D4S _V5 size, unmanaged disks in a storage account, and a NIC connected to App Subnet with no public IP address. Option C. Create VM-App01 with the Windows Server 2022 image, standard _D4S _V5 size, a NIC connected to App Subnet, managed disks, and no public IP address. Option D. Create VM-App01 with the Windows Server 2022 image, standard _B2S size, a NIC connected to App Subnet, managed disks, and no public IP address. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Create VM-App01 with the Windows Server 2022 image, standard _D4S _V5 size, a NIC connected to App Subnet, managed disks, and no public IP address. A VM deployment must combine the required image, size, network interface / subnet placement, and disk model. Managed disks let Azure handle the storage account layer for VM disks. Omitting the public IP address prevents direct internet reachability, while the VM remains connected to the selected virtual network subnet. Exam clue. For VM creation questions, check every build sheet field: image, size, disk model, NIC/subnet, and public IP. One wrong field can make an otherwise plausible deployment invalid. Question 4. Choose 2. You are planning address spaces for 3 Azure virtual networks that must be peered in a hub and spoke design. Hub VNet uses 10.20.0.0/16. Spoke 1 uses 10.21.0.0/16. A developer proposes Spoke 2 with an address space of 10.20.10.0/24 because only a small subnet is needed. You need the design to support virtual network peering between all 3 VNets and avoid future address conflicts. Which 2 actions should you take? Option A. Change Spoke 2 to a non-overlapping address space, such as 10.22.0.0/16 before creating the peering. Option B. Use subnet delegation on Spoke 2 so Azure treats the delegated subnet as separate from the VNet address space during peering. Option C. Verify that every VNet address space is unique and does not overlap with the hub, other spokes, or connected on-premises ranges. Option D. Keep Spoke 2 as 10.20.10.0/24 because it is a smaller prefix than Hub VNet and will be treated as a separate subnet during peering. Option E. Create the peering first and then add a route table to force traffic from Spoke 2 to Hub VNet through a network virtual appliance. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are A, C. A and C. Azure Virtual Network Peering requires the peered virtual networks to have non-overlapping IP address spaces. Spoke 2's proposed 10.20.10.0/24 range overlaps with Hub VNet's 10.20.0.0/16 range because it is contained within that larger CIDR block. The right design is to choose a unique non-overlapping address range for Spoke 2 and verify the full IP plan against the hub, other spokes, and any connected on-premises networks before creating peering. Exam clue. If a VNet prefix is inside another VNet prefix, it overlaps even if it looks more specific. Peering needs non-overlapping VNet address spaces. UDRs, subnet delegation, and NSGs do not fix an invalid IP plan. Question 5. Pick one of 4. You need to investigate detailed data plane operations for an Azure storage account, including read and write operations against blobs. The operations must be queryable with KQL in a log analytics workspace. You open logs for the storage account, but no resource log data is available. Platform metrics for the storage account are visible. What should you configure? Option A. Enable VM Insights for the resource group that contains the storage account. Option B. Create a metric alert rule for the storage account and attach an action group. Option C. Export the subscription activity log to the log analytics workspace. Option D. Create a diagnostic setting for the storage account resource, select the required resource log categories, and send them to the log analytics workspace. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Create a diagnostic setting for the storage account resource, select the required resource log categories, and send them to the log analytics workspace. Azure resources generate resource logs automatically, but resource logs are not collected by default. A diagnostic setting defines which resource log categories and metrics to collect and where to send them. Sending the storage account resource logs to a log analytics workspace makes them available for KQL queries after ingestion. Exam clue. Metrics can appear without resource logs. If the question asks for detailed resource operations in KQL, look for diagnostic settings that send resource logs to log analytics, not alert rules or activity log export. Question 6. Choose 2. Contoso needs to give 3 consultants from a partner company access to an internal enterprise application and a specific Azure resource group. The consultant should sign in with their own organizational accounts, and Contoso wants access to be managed through group membership, so it can be removed easily when the contract ends. Which 2 actions should you take? Option A. Invite the consultants as Microsoft Entra B2B guest users in the Contoso tenant. Option B. Assign the global administrator role to each consultant so they can request access to the application and resource group themselves. Option C. Create a management group for the consultants and move the resource group under that management group. Option D. Add the guest users to a Microsoft Entra security group, assign the enterprise application to the group, and assign the needed Azure RBAC role to the group at the resource group scope. Option E. Create local member user accounts for each consultant in the Contoso tenant and give them temporary passwords. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are A, D, A and D. Microsoft Entra B2B collaboration lets external users be invited into the resource tenant as guest users while they authenticate with their own credentials. After the guest objects exist, they can be managed like other users for access purposes, including being added to groups. Assigning the enterprise application and Azure RBAC access to a security group centralizes the access model, so removing a consultant from the group removes their app and resource access without editing each assignment individually. Exam clue. For external collaborators, look for B2B guest invitation plus least privilege access assignment. If the scenario says manage access through group membership, assign the app and Azure RBAC role to a group, not directly to each guest or to a tenant-wide admin role. Question 7. Pick one of 4. You have an existing Azure storage account named STAP01 that currently uses Microsoft Managed Keys for encryption. Your security team requires the storage account to use a customer-managed key stored in Azure Key Vault. You need to configure the storage account so Azure Storage can access the key without storing credentials in the application. What should you do? Option A. Enable a managed identity for the storage account, grant that identity access to the key in Key Vault, and configure the storage account encryption setting to use the customer-managed key. Option B. Regenerate the storage account access keys and store the new access key in Key Vault. Option C. Enable blob versioning and soft delete on the storage account, and then select Microsoft Managed Keys for encryption. Option D. Copy the Key Vault key value into an application setting and configure the application to pass the key to the storage account at runtime. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Enable a managed identity for the storage account, grant that identity access to the key in Key Vault, and configure the storage account encryption setting to use the customer-managed key. Azure Storage supports customer-managed keys stored in Azure Key Vault or Key Vault Managed HSM. For an existing storage account, Azure Storage can use either a system-assigned or user-assigned managed identity to authenticate to Key Vault. That identity must be granted permissions or the appropriate Key Vault crypto role to access the key, and then the storage account encryption setting is changed from Microsoft Managed Keys to the selected Customer Managed Key. Exam clue: do not confuse storage account access keys with encryption keys. Customer Managed Key scenarios usually require three pieces: Key Vault key, managed identity, and permission for that identity to use the key. Question 8. Choose 2. You need to configure object replication for block blobs from a source storage account to a destination storage account. Both accounts are general-purpose V2 storage accounts, and you have contributor permissions on both accounts. Replication must copy new block blob changes from a source container to a destination container. Which two prerequisites must you configure before creating the object replication policy? Option A. Configure customer-managed keys on both storage accounts. Option B. Enable blob versioning on both the source storage account and the destination storage account. Option C. Enable the blob change feed on the source storage account. Option D. Create snapshots of all existing source blobs before the policy is created. Option E. Enable a hierarchical namespace on both storage accounts. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are B, C. B and C. Azure Blob Storage object replication requires blob versioning to be enabled on both the source and destination accounts, and the blob change feed to be enabled on the source account. Azure Storage uses the source account change feed to detect blob changes and asynchronously replicate supported blob operations, according to the replication policy and rules. Exam clue: for object replication, remember the pair: versioning on both accounts, change feed on the source. HNS Data Lake Gen 2 is a red flag because object replication is not supported when hierarchical namespace is enabled. Question 9. Pick one of 4. You are deploying a public Azure load balancer for a production web application. The application must have a stable internet-facing IP address that clients can allow list, and the endpoint should use the production recommended SKU with availability zone support in a supported region. You need to configure the front-end IP for the load balancer. What should you create and associate with the load balancer front-end? Option A. A private front-end IP address from the back-end subnet, associated with an internal load balancer. Option B. A standard SKU public IP address with static allocation, associated with the load balancer front-end IP configuration. Option C. A basic SKU public IP prefix with dynamic allocation, associated with the back-end pool. Option D. A basic SKU public IP address with dynamic allocation, associated directly with each backend VM network interface. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is B, a standard SKU public IP address with static allocation associated with the load balancer front-end IP configuration. A public load balancer uses a front-end IP configuration as the internet-facing virtual IP. For production workloads, Microsoft recommends a standard SKU load balancer and matching a standard SKU public IP address. Standard public IP addresses use static allocation and support availability zones in supported regions, which satisfies the stable allow listed endpoint and production availability requirements. Exam clue. For production public load balancers, match the SKU, standard load balancer plus standard public IP. Standard public IPs are static. Basic or dynamic IP choices are usually traps when the scenario says production or allow list. Question 10. Answer yes or no. Your team receives Azure Monitor alert notifications through action groups. During a planned maintenance window for several virtual machines in one resource group, you want alerts to continue firing and remain visible in Azure Monitor, but you do not want notification action groups to be invoked for those maintenance scope alerts during the window. Proposed solution. Create an alert processing rule scoped to the resource group. Configure the rule action to suppress notifications, and configure the schedule for the maintenance window. Does this meet the goal? Option A, yes. Option B, no. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A, yes. Yes. Alert processing rules modify fired alerts as they are being fired. A suppression alert processing rule removes all action groups from affected fired alerts, so the alerts do not invoke notifications during the configured maintenance window. The alerts still fire and remain visible in Azure Monitor, Azure Resource Graph, API, or PowerShell. Exam clue. Suppressed notifications is not the same as disabling alert rules. Disabling alert rules prevents new alerts from firing. An alert processing rule suppresses action groups for fired alerts based on scope, filters, and schedule. Question 11. Pick one of four. You need to pilot Microsoft Entra Self-Service Password Reset, SSPR, for 25 users before enabling it for the entire tenant. The pilot users are members of a security group named SSPR-pilot. Users must provide two verification methods when they reset their password, and they should be prompted to register their authentication information at sign-in. What should you configure? Option A, enable SSPR for selected users, and select the SSPR-pilot group. Set the number of methods required to reset to 2, and require users to register when signing in. Option B, enable password writeback for the SSPR-pilot group and leave SSPR disabled until all users have registered 2 methods. Option C, enable SSPR for all users. Set the number of methods required to reset to 1 and disable registration prompts until the pilot ends. Option D, create an authentication methods policy scoped to SSPR-pilot only, and do not configure the password reset properties page. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Enable SSPR for selected users and select the SSPR pilot group. Set the number of methods required to reset to 2 and require users to register when signing in. Microsoft Entra ID supports enabling SSPR for none, selected, or all users. For a pilot, enable SSPR for selected users and choose the pilot security group. Then configure the authentication method settings so that 2 methods are required to reset, and configure registration settings to require users to register when signing in. Exam clue. SSPR has 3 separate knobs that often get mixed up. Properties controls who is enabled, Authentication methods controls how many/which methods are required, and registration controls whether users are prompted to register at sign-in. Question 12. Build list. An application currently uses the primary access key in its Azure Storage Account connection string. You need to manually rotate both storage account access keys with minimal application downtime. In which order should you perform the actions? Choice A. Regenerate the secondary access key. Choice B. Update the application connection string to use the new primary access key. Choice C. Update the application connection string to use the secondary access key. Choice D. Regenerate the primary access key. Put the steps in the correct order before the reveal. The correct order is C, D, B, A. Azure storage accounts have two access keys, so applications can maintain access while keys are rotated. If applications currently use the primary key, first update the connection strings to use the secondary key. Then regenerate the primary key. Next, update applications to use the new primary key. Finally, regenerate the secondary key. Regenerating a key before clients stop using it can break applications that depend on that key. Exam clue. For storage key rotation, never regenerate the key currently used by the app. Move apps to the other key, regenerate the unused key, move apps to the newly regenerated key, then regenerate the remaining key. Question 13. Pick one of four. You need to deploy a stateless web tier on Azure virtual machines. The solution must remain available if a single data center in the region fails, and it must automatically add or remove VM instances based on demand. You want to use the option that provides the strongest VM-based resiliency for this requirement. What should you deploy? Option A. 3 standalone VMs in 3 availability zones without a scale set. Option B. 2 standalone VMs in the same availability set. Option C. A virtual machine scale set that spans multiple availability zones and has autoscale rules configured. Option D. A virtual machine scale set deployed in one availability zone with manual capacity changes. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is C. A virtual machine scale set that spans multiple availability zones and has autoscale rules configured. A zone-spanning virtual machine scale set spreads instances across selected availability zones, which protects the workload from a single zone or data center level failure and provides the highest VM-based availability pattern for this scenario. Scale sets also centrally manage multiple VMMs and can automatically increase or decrease instance count based on demand or schedule when autoscale rules are configured. Exam clue. Availability sets protect against rack/fault domain and update domain issues inside a region. Availability zones protect against data center level failures. VM scale sets add centralized management and autoscale. If the scenario says both zone failure resiliency and automatic scale out, scale in, think zone spanning VMSS with autoscale. Question 14. Matching. You are designing network controls for several Azure workloads. Match each requirement to the most appropriate Azure networking feature. Requirement 1. Group virtual machine network interfaces by application role so NSG rules can reference logical groups instead of individual IP addresses. Requirement 2. Filter inbound and outbound virtual network traffic by source, destination, port, and protocol. Requirement 3. Allow AVM to receive inbound connections directly from the internet through an Azure-assigned address. Requirement 4. Restrict access to an Azure storage account from selected virtual network subnets while traffic still uses the Azure Service Public Endpoint and Azure Backbone. Requirement 5. Expose a specific Azure storage account through a private IP address in a virtual network, and allow the storage account public endpoint to be disabled. Option A, service endpoint. Option B, public IP address. Option C, application security group ASG. Option D, private endpoint. Option E, network security group NSG. Match each requirement to the most appropriate Azure networking feature. Each feature may be used once. Choose each match before the reveal. The correct matches are 1C, 2E, 3B, 4A, 5D. Requirement 1 matches option C, Application Security Group, ASG. Requirement 2 matches option E, Network Security Group, NSG. Requirement 3 matches option B, Public IP Address. Requirement 4 matches option A, Service Endpoint. Requirement 5 matches option D, Private Endpoint. Application security groups group VM network interfaces by application role, so NSG rules can use logical groups instead of explicit IP addresses. Network security groups filter traffic by the 5-tuple of source, source port, destination, destination port, and protocol. A public IP address enables internet-reachable inbound connectivity to Azure resources such as VMs or load balancers when allowed by security rules. A service endpoint extends a subnet to an Azure service over the Azure backbone and lets the target service firewall allow selected virtual network subnets while DNS still resolves to the service public endpoint. A private endpoint creates a network interface with the private IP address in the virtual network for a specific Azure resource, such as a storage account, and the public endpoint can be disabled or blocked separately. Exam clue. Remember the layers. ASG is a label/group used inside NSG rules. NSG is the packet filter. Public IP is internet reachability. Service endpoint secures subnet to service access while the service endpoint remains public. Private endpoint gives one PaaS resource a private IP in your VNet. Question 15. Choose 2. You need to give operations staff curated Azure Monitor views without requiring them to write KQL queries. One team must identify VM, CPU, memory, disk, and network bottlenecks across monitored virtual machines. Another team must review storage account availability, latency, transactions, capacity, and errors across subscriptions. Which 2 Azure Monitor experiences should you use? Option A, Azure Advisor Recommendations. Option B, Network Watcher Connection Monitor. Option C, Log Analytics Logs with a custom KQL query. Option D, VM Insights Performance View. Option E, Azure Monitor Storage Insights. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are D, E. D and E. VM Insights provides curated performance charts and views for monitored VMs, including key guest performance indicators such as CPU, memory, disk, and network utilization, helping teams identify bottlenecks and anomalies without writing KQL. Azure Monitor Storage Insights provides a unified workbook-based view for storage accounts across subscriptions, including availability, latency, transaction metrics, capacity, and errors. Exam clue. If the task asks for curated monitoring dashboards, look for an Insights experience. VM Insights is for guest VM performance and dependency visibility. Storage Insights is for storage performance, capacity, availability, and failures. Use raw log/KQL when the question asks for custom log analysis, not pre-built views. Question 16. Choose the best answer. Your company has a regional help desk team for the Paris office. The team must reset passwords and manage user properties only for Paris users. They must not receive tenant-wide user administrator permissions. You create a Microsoft Entra administrative unit named Paris AU. What should you do next? Option A. Assign the Help Desk Administrator role to the Help Desk team at Tenant Scope, and mark Paris AU as Restricted Management. Option B. Add a group that contains the Paris users to Paris AU, and rely on the group membership so the Help Desk team can reset passwords for the individual users in that group. Option C. Assign the User Administrator role to the Help Desk team at Tenant Scope, and add Paris AU to a dynamic group. Option D. Add the Paris users directly as members of Paris AU, and assign the User Administrator role to the Help Desk team with Paris AU as the scope. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Add the Paris users directly as members of Paris AU, and assign the User Administrator role to the Help Desk team with Paris AU as the scope. Microsoft Entra administrative units let you restrict a role assignment to a defined subset of users, groups, or devices. A role assigned with administrative unit scope applies only when managing members of that administrative unit, and does not grant tenant-wide permissions. For individual user management tasks such as resetting passwords or changing user properties, the users must be direct members of the administrative unit. Adding only a group object brings the group into scope, not the group members. Exam clue. For intra-administrative units, think 2 parts. Put the target objects directly in the administrative unit, then assign the admin role at the administrative unit scope. A group inside an administrative unit is managed as a group object. It does not automatically place every group member into user management scope. Question 17. Choose the best answer. A storage account contains millions of block blobs in several containers. You need to automatically move only processed raw video files to the archive tier 90 days after they were last modified. The files are stored under the prefix videofiles/raw and have blob index tags status equals processed and source equals raw. You must avoid affecting other blobs in the account. What should you configure? Option A. Set the default access tier of the storage account to archive, and add blob index tags to the processed raw video files. Option B. Use log analytics to query blobs with status equals processed and source equals raw, and then create an alert rule to change their tier to archive. Option C. Create a lifecycle management rule with only a prefix match filter for video files/raw, and a delete action after 90 days since last modification. Option D. Create a blob lifecycle management rule for base blobs with a prefix match filter for video files/raw, a blob index match filter for status equals processed and source equals raw, and a tier to archive action after 90 days since last modification. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Create a blob lifecycle management rule for base blobs with a prefix match filter for video files/raw, a blob index match filter for status equals processed and source equals raw, and a tier to archive action after 90 days since last modification. Azure Blob Storage Lifecycle Management can transition current versions, previous versions, or snapshots to cooler tiers based on creation time, last modified time, or last access time. Rules can be scoped by prefix filters and blob index tag filters, and when multiple filters are present, they are combined with logical AND. Therefore, a lifecycle rule for base blobs with both the video files raw prefix and the status equals processed plus source equals raw blob index matches will target only the intended blobs before applying tier to archive after the 90-day last modified condition. Exam clue. Lifecycle management is the AZ-104 answer for deterministic storage tiering and retention. Use prefix match for path-like targeting and blob index match for tag-based targeting. Multiple lifecycle filters narrow the target set. They do not broaden it. Question 18. Choose the best answer. You manage a virtual machine scale set that hosts a web application. The scale set must keep at least 2 instances online, must never exceed 10 instances, and should normally start with 2 instances. When average CPU across a scale set is greater than 70% for 10 minutes, Azure should add capacity. When average CPU drops below 30% for 10 minutes, Azure should remove capacity. What should you configure? Option A. Create an Azure Monitor metric alert on percentage CPU greater than 70, and configure the alert action group to restart the scale set instances. Option B. Create an Azure Monitor autoscale setting for the VM scale set with a profile minimum of 2, maximum of 10, and default of 2. Add a scale-out rule based on percentage CPU greater than 70, and a scale-in rule based on percentage CPU less than 30. Option C. Change the VM scale set manual instance count to 10 and configure the upgrade policy to automatic. Option D. Create a scheduled autoscale condition that sets the instance count to 10 during business hours and 2 outside business hours. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is B. Create an Azure Monitor autoscale setting for the VM scale set with a profile minimum of 2, maximum of 10, and default of 2. Add a scale-out rule based on percentage CPU grateful 70 and a scale-in rule based on percentage CPU less than 30. Azure Monitor Autoscale is a native way to add or remove instances for a virtual machine scale set based on metrics such as percentage CPU. An autoscale setting includes one or more profiles, and each profile defines a minimum, maximum, and default instance count. Rules in the profile evaluate metrics and trigger scale-out or scale-in actions. To meet this scenario, set the profile capacity to minimum 2, maximum 10, default 2. Then add a CPU scale-out rule for greater than 70% and a CPU scale-in rule for less than 30% over the required evaluation window. Exam clue. For VMSS autoscale questions, separate 3 knobs: capacity limits, minimum, maximum, default, metric rules, for example, percentage CPU, and actions, scale out or scale in. Manual instance count and upgrade policy are common distractors. Question 19. Does the solution meet the goal? A company has a storage account named STAP1 and a virtual network named VNet1. VNet1 contains a subnet named subnet1 that hosts application virtual machines. You need to restrict network access to STAP1 so that requests are allowed only from subnet1 while keeping DNS unchanged and avoiding a private endpoint. Proposed solution. Enable the Microsoft.storage service endpoint on subnet1. On STAP1, set public network access to selected virtual networks and IP addresses. Add a virtual network rule for subnet1 and leave all other networks denied. Does this solution meet the goal? Option A, yes. Option B, no. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A, yes. Yes. Azure Storage Firewall Virtual Network rules allow traffic from specific subnets, and Microsoft states that the subnet must also have a virtual network service endpoint enabled for Azure Storage. With public network access set to selected virtual networks and IP addresses, and the default action denying other sources, only explicitly allowed sources, such as subnet 1, can reach the storage account public endpoint. Service endpoints route over the Azure backbone and keep DNS unchanged. Unlike private endpoints, they do not assign a private IP to the storage account. Access from the allowed subnet still must satisfy storage authentication and authorization requirements. Exam clue. For AZ-104, Service endpoint plus storage firewall virtual network rule is the classic answer for allow this subnet to a storage account over the public endpoint. Private endpoint is the answer when the scenario requires a private IP, private link, private DNS, on-premises private reachability, or stronger resource instance isolation. Question 20. Matching. You administer Azure resources for a production workload. Match each monitoring requirement to the best Azure Monitor feature or configuration. Requirement 1. Notify the operations team when a virtual machine's platform metric crosses a CPU threshold with near real-time evaluation. Requirement 2. Run a KQL query against resource logs in a log analytics workspace and fire when the query returns matching error events. Requirement 3. Notify the team when an Azure resource is deleted or when a service health event is written to the Azure activity log. Requirement 4. Send a resource's platform logs and metrics to a log analytics workspace, event hubs, or a storage account for later analysis or retention. Requirement 5. Temporarily suppress alert notifications during planned maintenance without deleting or disabling the alert rules. Option A. Diagnostic setting. Option B. Activity log alert. Option C. Alert processing rule. Option D. Metric alert. Option E. Log search alert. Match each requirement to the best Azure Monitor feature. Each feature may be used once. Choose each match before the reveal. The correct matches are 1D, 2E, 3B, 4A, 5C. Requirement 1 matches option D, metric alert. Requirement 2 matches option E, log search alert. Requirement 3 matches option B, activity log alert. Requirement 4 matches option A, diagnostic setting. Requirement 5 matches option C, alert processing rule. Metric alerts evaluate resource metrics, such as CPU, at regular intervals. Log search alerts use KQL queries over log analytics data and fire when query conditions are met. Activity log alerts trigger from Azure activity log events, including resource operations, resource health, and service health. Diagnostic settings send resource logs and metrics to destinations such as log analytics workspaces, event hubs, and storage accounts. Alert processing rules can modify or suppress alert notifications during scenarios such as planned maintenance without deleting the original alert rules. Exam clue. Identify the signal first. Metrics, metric alert. KQL over logs, log search alert. Azure control plane or health events, activity log alert. Collect, export logs and metrics, diagnostic setting. Suppress notifications, alert processing rule. Question 21. Matching. You administer identity and governance for an Azure environment. Match each requirement to the best Microsoft Entra ID or Azure governance feature. Requirement 1. Allow a pilot set of users to reset or unlock their own accounts without contacting the help desk. Requirement 2. Grant a support team just enough permissions to restart virtual machines in a resource group without granting subscription-wide access. Requirement 3. Prevent users from creating non-compliant resources, such as resources in unapproved regions, regardless of who submits the deployment. Requirement 4. Prevent accidental deletion of a critical resource, even by users who otherwise have permissions to modify the resource. Requirement 5. Assign access or licenses to a changing set of users by managing membership in one directory object rather than updating each user individually. Option A. Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC. Option B. Resource Lock. Option C. Microsoft Entra Self-Service Password Reset, SSPR. Option D. Microsoft Entra Group. Option E. Azure Policy. Match each requirement to the best feature. Each feature may be used once. Choose each match before the reveal. The correct matches are 1-C, 2-A, 3-E, 4-B, 5-D. Requirement 1 matches option C, Microsoft Entra Self-Service Password Reset, SSPR. Requirement 2 matches option A, Azure Role-Based Access Control, Azure RBAC. Requirement 3 matches option E, Azure Policy. Requirement 4 matches option B, Resource Lock. Requirement 5 matches option D, Microsoft Entra Group. Microsoft Entra SSPR is used when users need to reset or unlock their own accounts. Azure RBAC grants permissions to perform actions on Azure resources at scopes such as management group, subscription, resource group, or resource. Azure Policy evaluates resource properties and can deny or audit non-compliant deployments regardless of who submits them. Resource locks apply management restrictions, such as cannot delete or encryption, across all users and roles to protect critical resources. Microsoft Entra groups are directory objects used to manage a changing set of users for assignments, such as access or licenses. Exam clue: separate identity plane and resource plane controls. SSPR is user password recovery. Entra groups aggregate identities. Azure RBAC grants actions. Azure Policy enforces resource compliance. Locks protect resources from delete/update operations even when users otherwise have access. Question 22. Select the best answer. You manage a pay-as-you-go Azure file share named Share1. The application team reports that the share must be allowed to grow beyond its current limit. Before a risky application deployment, they also want a point-in-time copy that can be used to restore individual files if the deployment corrupts data. Later, another administrator accidentally deletes the entire file share. Soft delete for Azure file shares was enabled before the deletion, and the retention period has not expired. What should you do? Option A. Edit the file share quota to the required size, create a share snapshot before the deployment, and restore the deleted share by showing deleted shares and selecting Undelete. Option B. Change the storage account replication setting, create a blob snapshot before the deployment, and recover the deleted share by restoring the storage account from a storage account recovery request. Option C. Enable blob soft delete. Create an Azure Backup Vault snapshot only after the deployment completes, and wait for the deleted share to return automatically when the retention period expires. Option D. Create a new file share with a larger quota, copy the live files into it, delete all existing share snapshots to release space, and recover the deleted share by disabling soft delete. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Edit the file share quota to the required size, create a share snapshot before the deployment, and restore the deleted share by showing deleted shares and selecting Undelete. For an Azure file share, the quota setting limits the maximum size of the share and can be edited on the file share. A share snapshot captures a point-in-time state of an SMB or NFS Azure file share and can be used to restore previous versions of files after accidental changes or corruption. Soft delete works at the file share level. If the share is deleted while soft delete is enabled, it enters a soft deleted state and can be restored by showing deleted shares and selecting Undelete before the retention period expires. Exam clue. For Azure Files, do not mix blob features with file share features. Quota controls file share growth, share snapshots are file share point-in-time copies, and file share soft delete restores the whole deleted share within retention. Question 23. Build list. You need to deploy an Azure Container Apps workload from a private Azure Container Registry image. The registry admin credentials must remain disabled, and the container app must authenticate to ACR by using a managed identity. In which order should you perform the actions? Choice A. Update the container app to use the private image from the Azure Container Registry. Choice B, create the container app with a public quick start image in the container apps environment. Choice C, configure the container app registry settings to use the managed identity for the ACR login server. Choice D, assign or enable the managed identity for the container app and ensure it has ACR pull on the registry. Put the steps in the correct order before the reveal. The correct order is B, D, C, A. Azure Container Apps can pull private Azure Container Registry images by using a managed identity instead of registry username and password credentials. The safe workflow is to create the container app first with a public image, enable or assign the managed identity, and make sure the identity has the ACR pull role on the registry. Configure the container app registry entry to use that identity for the ACR login server, and then update or create the revision that uses the private image. Updating to the private image before the identity and registry configuration are in place can cause the revision to fail image pull. Exam clue. For container app's private ACR pulls, do identity and registry authentication before switching to the private image. Do not enable ACR admin credentials when the requirement says Managed Identity. Question 24. Select the best answer. You need to peer VNet 1 and VNet 2. VNet 1 uses address space 10.40.0.0/16. VNet 2 uses address space 10.40.20.0/24. The peering creation fails. NSG rules and route tables have not been customized. What should you do to allow the peering to be created? Option A. Add a route table to VNet 2 with a route for 10.40.0.0/16 that uses next hop type virtual network peering. Option B. Allow forwarded traffic on both peering objects and retry the peering without changing either address space. Option C. Change one virtual network address space so the two VNets use non-overlapping IP ranges. Then create the peering. Option D. Create an NSG rule that allows virtual network to virtual network traffic on both VNets. Then retry the peering. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Change one virtual network address space so the two VNets use non-overlapping IP ranges, then create the peering. Azure Virtual Networks must have non-overlapping IP address spaces to be peered. In this scenario, 10.40.20.0/24 is contained inside 10.40.0.0/16, so the peering fails because the address ranges overlap. Route tables, NSGs, and forwarded traffic settings are evaluated only after a valid network path or peering exists. They do not make overlapping address spaces valid. The fix is to resize or recreate one VNet address range so the address spaces do not overlap. Then create or retry the peering. Exam clue. When VNet peering fails at creation time, check address space overlap before troubleshooting routes, NSGs, or peering traffic flags. Overlapping CIDRs must be fixed at the VNet address plan. Question 25. Choose two answers. You manage Azure Monitor alerts for a production workload. The operations team must receive a text message when a critical alert fires, and the same alert must also call an internal incident management HTTP endpoint. You want to reuse the notification configuration across multiple alert rules. Which two actions should you perform? Option A. Create one separate metric alert rule for SMS and another separate metric alert rule for the webhook, because action groups cannot contain multiple receiver types. Option B. Create an action group that includes a webhook action receiver that targets the incident management HTTP endpoint. Option C. Configure an alert processing rule as the only response object and omit the action group from the alert rules. Option D. Create a diagnostic setting on the workload and select SMS and webhook as destinations. Option E. Create an action group that includes an SMS notification receiver for the operations contact. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are B, E. B and E. Azure Monitor uses action groups to define reusable notification and action receivers for alerts. To meet the requirements, configure an action group with an SMS notification receiver for the operations contact and a webhook action receiver for the incident management HTTP endpoint. Then the same action group can be attached to multiple alert rules. Diagnostic settings are for log/metric export destinations, not SMS/webhook alert response, and alert processing rules are not a replacement for defining the action receivers. Exam clue. For alert response, separate the signal from the response. The alert rule defines the condition. The action group defines who or what is notified, including SMS and webhook receivers, and can be reused. Question 26. Answer yes or no. Your organization has an Azure Policy assignment at a management group that denies creation of resources outside approved Azure regions. One subscription under that management group has a temporary business exception to deploy resources in an otherwise denied region. All other subscriptions must continue to inherit and enforce the management group policy assignment. Proposed solution. Create an Azure Policy exemption at the exception subscription scope for the inherited policy assignment. Configure the exemption category and expiration, and leave the management group policy assignment in place. Does this meet the goal? Option A, yes. Option B, no. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A, yes. Yes. Azure Policy exemptions let you exempt a scoped resource hierarchy, such as a subscription, from evaluation of a specific assignment while preserving the assignment itself. Creating the exemption at the exception subscription scope limits the exception to that subscription, while the management group policy assignment continues to apply to other subscriptions. Adding an exemption category and expiration documents, whether it is a waiver or mitigated case, and keeps the temporary exception time-bounded. Exam clue. For one child scope exception under an inherited Azure Policy assignment, do not delete or edit the parent assignment. Use a policy exemption at the child scope and keep the broader assignment in place. Question 27. Choose two answers. A partner company needs temporary upload access to a single blob container for the next 7 days. The partner cannot be added to your Microsoft Intra tenant. You need to grant only the permissions required to upload blobs. And you want a practical way to revoke the delegated access before the 7 days expire, without rotating the storage account keys. Which two actions should you perform? Option A. Associate the SaaS with a stored access policy on the container, so the policy can be changed or deleted to revoke access. Option B. Assign the partner the storage blob data contributor role on the container scope. Option C. Give the partner the storage account access key and ask them to stop using it after 7 days. Option D. Create a service SaaS scoped to the target container, with only the required write create permissions and a 7-day expiry. Option E. Enable public anonymous write access on the container, and disable it after 7 days. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are A, D, A, and D. A service SaaS is designed to delegate limited access to a storage resource, such as a blob container, with specific permissions and an expiry time. Because the partner cannot use Microsoft Entra authentication in this scenario, a SaaS is the appropriate temporary delegation mechanism. Associating the SaaS with a stored access policy on the container gives you a revocation control. You can change or delete the stored access policy to invalidate SaaS tokens that depend on it, without rotating the storage account keys. Account keys and public access are over-permissive, and Azure RBAC requires a usable Microsoft Entra principle. Exam clue. For external temporary blob access, SAS is the delegation tool. For revocation without key rotation, look for a stored access policy tied to a service SAS. Do not hand out account keys. Question 28. Select the best answer. You host a web app in Azure App Service. The app must connect outbound to a database that is reachable only through a private IP address in a virtual network. You do not need to make the web app itself privately reachable from clients. Which networking feature should you configure for the web app? Option A. Configure an app service access restriction rule that allows the database subnet. Option B. Configure regional virtual network integration for the app service app and integrate it with a delegated subnet in the virtual network. Option C. Create a private endpoint for the app service app and leave virtual network integration disabled. Option D. Assign a public IP address to the app service app and add a route table to the database subnet. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is B. Configure regional virtual network integration for the app service app and integrate it with a delegated subnet in the virtual network. Azure App Service Virtual Network Integration is used for outbound connectivity from an app to resources in a virtual network. When the web app must call a database over a private IP address, the app should use regional VNet integration with an appropriate subnet. A private endpoint for app service solves the opposite direction, private inbound access to the app. Access restrictions also control inbound traffic to the app, not outbound database connectivity. Exam clue. For app service networking, direction matters. Private endpoint is inbound to the app. VNet integration is outbound from the app to private resources in a VNet. Question 29. Build list. You manage a virtual network that contains web tier VMs and app tier VMs. The app tier VMs must allow TCP 8080 only from the web tier VMs. The solution must avoid hard-coding VM private IP addresses in the security rule, so that VMs can be added to either tier later. In which order should you configure the solution? Choice A. Create an inbound NSG rule that allows TCP 8080 with the web tier ASG as the source and the app tier ASG as the destination. Choice B. Associate the NSG that contains the rule with the app tier subnet or app tier network interfaces. Choice C. Create application security groups for the web tier and the app tier in the target region. Choice D. Add the web tier VM network interfaces to the web tier ASG and the app tier VM network interfaces to the app tier ASG. Put the steps in the correct order before the reveal. The correct order is C, D, A, B. Application security groups let you group VM network interfaces by application role, and use those groups as source or destination in network security group rules. To avoid hard-coded private IP addresses, first create ASGs for the web and app tiers. Then place the correct VM NICs into each ASG. Next, create an inbound NSG rule that allows TCP 8080 from the web tier ASG to the app tier ASG. Finally, associate the NSG with the app tier subnet, or NICs, so the rule is enforced at the app tier. Creating IP-based rules, or applying the NSG before defining the ASG-based rule, misses the requirement to use tier membership rather than fixed addresses. Exam clue. For ASG questions, think object, membership, NSG rule, association. ASGs label NICs. NSGs enforce rules that can reference those labels as source and destination. Question 30. Select the best answer. You need to configure Azure Backup for several Azure virtual machines. The operations team must use backup policies, retain VM recovery points, and be able to restore an entire VM or recover files from a VM recovery point. Which Azure Vault type should you create for this workload? Option A. Create a storage account with blob versioning and lifecycle management to store the VM recovery points. Option B. Create a backup vault because all Azure Backup workloads now require backup vaults instead of recovery services vaults. Option C. Create a recovery services vault and configure Azure VM backup policies in that vault. Option D. Create an Azure Site Recovery vault and configure replication policies for the virtual machines. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Create a recovery services vault and configure Azure VM backup policies in that vault. Azure Backup protects Azure virtual machines by storing recovery points in a recovery services vault. The vault is the management boundary for VM backup policies, retention, and restore operations, such as restoring a full VM or recovering files from a recovery point. Backup Vault is a different vault resource used for specific newer backup workloads, and storage account lifecycle features or site recovery replication do not satisfy the Azure VM backup policy and restore requirements. Exam clue: match the vault to the workload. Azure VM Backup and VM/file restore point management point to a recovery services vault. Backup Vault is not a blanket replacement for every Azure Backup workload. Question 31. Choose 3 answers. You need to delegate administration of one Azure subscription to an operations team. The team must be able to create and manage resources in the subscription and assign Azure RBAC roles to application teams. The delegation must be limited to this subscription and must avoid granting unnecessary permissions such as full owner rights. Which 3 actions should you perform? Option A. Assign the contributor role to the operations team at the subscription scope. Option B. Use the subscription as the role assignment scope instead of assigning the roles at the tenant root management group. Option C. Assign the owner role at the subscription scope instead of combining more specific roles. Option D. Assign the user access administrator role to the operations team at the subscription scope. Option E. Create a cannot delete lock on the subscription to allow the team to assign roles without user access administrator. Option F. Assign contributor at the management group scope so the team can administer the one subscription through inheritance. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are A, B, D. A, B, and D. Azure RBAC should be assigned at the narrowest scope that satisfies the requirement. Contributor at the subscription scope grants the operations team resource management permissions in that subscription, but it does not allow them to manage access. User access administrator at the same subscription scope grants the ability to manage role assignments. Using the subscription as the assignment scope keeps the delegation limited to that subscription. Owner would combine these capabilities, but grants broader permissions than required, and locks do not grant RBAC permissions. Exam clue: for least privilege delegation, separate resource management from access management. Contributor manages resources. User access administrator manages role assignments. Scope both as narrowly as possible. Question 32. Select the best answer. You create a storage account for internal application logs and need a blob container named logs. No anonymous users should be able to read the blobs in the container. Authorized users and applications will use Microsoft Entra authorization or SAS tokens when access is required. What should you configure? Option A. Create the container and set the public access level to private with anonymous access disabled. Option B. Keep the container public but restrict access by creating a storage account firewall rule for the application subnet. Option C. Set the container public access level to container so anonymous users can list and read the container contents. Option D. Set the container public access level to blob, so anonymous users can read only individual blobs if they know the URL. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Create the container and set the public access level to private with anonymous access disabled. Blob containers have public access levels that control anonymous read access. Private access disables anonymous access to both the container and its blobs, while authorized users or applications can still access data through supported authorization mechanisms, such as Microsoft Entra authorization, or SAS. Blob and container public access levels permit anonymous reads, and a firewall rule does not replace disabling anonymous public access at the container/account configuration boundary. Exam clue. For blob containers, private answers the anonymous access requirement. Firewalls control network reachability. SAS and RBAC authorize specific callers. Public access level controls anonymous reads. Question 33. Answer yes or no. You deploy a virtual machine by using an ARM template or Bicep file. You need the deployment to install a VM extension after the VM exists, and you need repeated deployments of the same template to converge the extension configuration instead of creating duplicate extension resources. Proposed solution. Define the VM extension as a child/extension resource with a stable extension name. Set the parent VM relationship or dependency so it deploys after the VM, and deploy the template in incremental mode. Does this meet the goal? Option A, yes. Option B, no. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A, yes. Yes, VM extensions are Azure resources associated with a virtual machine. In ARM or Bicep, defining the extension with a stable resource name gives it a consistent resource identity. So repeated deployments update or converge the same extension resource instead of creating duplicates. The extension must also depend on or be parented to the VM, so it is deployed after the VM exists. Incremental deployment mode preserves resources not in the template and applies changes to resources that are declared in the template. It does not require changing the extension name on each run. Exam clue. For idempotent template deployment, look for stable resource names and explicit dependencies. Deployment mode does not fix a changing name or missing dependency. Question 34. Select the best answer. You manage a public standard Azure load balancer with two backend virtual machines. The front-end IP and load balancing rule are configured correctly, and both VMMs are in the backend pool. The health probe is configured for TCP port 8080, but both backend instances show as unhealthy. The VM application is listening on port 8080. An NSG is associated with the backend subnet. What should you check first? Option A. Change the public front-end IP address to a dynamic basic public IP address. Option B. Remove both VMMs from the backend pool and add their public IP addresses directly to the load balancing rule. Option C. Create a public DNS CNAME record for the load balancer front-end name. Option D. Verify that the NSG allows the Azure Load Balancer Health Probe traffic to reach TCP port 8080 on the backend VMS. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Verify that the NSG allows the Azure Load Balancer Health Probe traffic to reach TCP port 8080 on the backend VMS. Azure Load Balancer uses health probes to decide whether backend instances are healthy and should receive traffic. If the application is listening on the configured probe port and the backend pool and rule are already configured, a subnet or NIC NSG that blocks probe traffic to that port is a likely cause of unhealthy backend status. Front-end IP settings and DNS records affect client entry points, not backend health probe reachability. Exam clue. For load balancer backend health, follow the probe path: backend pool membership, probe port/listener, and NSG allowance. DNS and front-end IP names do not make a backend healthy. Question 35. Build list. A user accidentally deleted several files from an Azure virtual machine. The VM is protected by Azure Backup. You need to restore only the deleted files from an existing recovery point without restoring or replacing the entire VM. In which order should you perform the actions? Choice A. Copy the required files from the mounted recovery point volumes to the target location on the VM or another host. Choice B. Select the protected VM and choose a recovery point for file recovery in the Recovery Services Vault. Choice C. Unmount the recovery point disks after the file copy is complete. Choice D. Download and run the file recovery script to mount the recovery point volumes on a suitable machine. Put the steps in the correct order before the reveal. The correct order is B, D, A, C. Azure Backup File Recovery for Azure VMS starts by selecting the protected VM and a recovery point that contains the files. Azure then provides a script that mounts the recovery point volumes on a suitable machine so the files can be browsed. After the volumes are mounted, copy only the needed files to the target location. When recovery is complete, unmount the disks to close the recovery point connection. Restoring the whole VM or copying before the recovery point is mounted does not meet the individual file restore workflow. Exam clue. For Azure VM file recovery, the order is recovery point, download, run, mount script, copy files, unmount. Do not restore the entire VM when the requirement is individual files. Question 36. Select the best answer. You manage an Azure subscription for a project team. The finance department requires an email notification when the subscription spend reaches 80% of a monthly spending threshold, and again when it reaches 100%. The solution should monitor actual cost against the threshold. It does not need to automatically block deployments. What should you configure? Option A. Create an Azure Advisor cost recommendation and configure it to send alerts at 80% and 100% of the monthly threshold. Option B. Apply an Azure Policy assignment that denies new resource creation when the subscription reaches 80% of the threshold. Option C. Create a read-only resource lock on the subscription, so spending stops when the cost threshold is reached. Option D. Create an Azure cost management budget scoped to the subscription with alert thresholds at 80% and 100%. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Create an Azure cost management budget scoped to the subscription with alert thresholds at 80% and 100%. Azure cost management budgets are designed to track cost or usage against a defined amount for a selected scope, such as a subscription. Budget alerts can notify recipients when actual or forecasted costs reach configured threshold percentages, such as 80% and 100% of a monthly budget. Advisor cost recommendations help identify optimization opportunities, while Azure Policy and resource locks are governance controls that do not provide monthly spend threshold alerting. Exam clue. When the requirement says notify when spend reaches a percentage of a monthly threshold, choose a cost management budget. Advisor recommends savings. Policy and locks govern resources, not budget alerts. Question 37. Answer yes or no. A storage account contains multiple blob containers. Only the container named sensitive must use a customer-managed key that is different from the key used for other containers. New blobs written to sensitive must use that container-specific encryption configuration by default. Proposed solution. Create an encryption scope that uses the required customer-managed key. Configure the sensitive container to use that encryption scope as its default encryption scope, and deny encryption scope overrides for that container. Does this meet the goal? Option A, yes. Option B, no. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Yes. Yes. Azure Storage encryption scopes let you define encryption settings that can apply to individual blobs or containers, including customer-managed keys. Setting the sensitive container default encryption scope causes new blobs in that container to use the specified scope by default. And denying encryption scope overrides prevents clients from choosing a different scope for uploads. Account-level customer-managed keys apply more broadly, and blob access tiers do not control encryption keys. Exam clue. When the requirement is a different encryption setting for one container or subset of blobs, think encryption scope. Account-level CMK is broader. Access tier is about storage cost performance, not encryption key selection. Question 38. Choose two answers. You host a production web app in Azure App Service. The app currently runs in a free app service plan. You need to configure scheduled app service backups for the app content and store the backup files in Azure Storage. Which two actions are required before the scheduled backups can run? Option A. Create an Azure VM snapshot of the app service worker instance. Option B. Enable Azure Advisor cost recommendations for the app service plan. Option C. Create or select an Azure Storage account and blob container where app service can store the backup files. Option D. Scale the app to an app service plan tier that supports app service backup, such as standard, premium, or isolated. Option E. Create a deployment slot and move the production app into the slot before configuring backups. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are C, D. C and D. Scheduled app service backups require the app to run in a supported app service plan tier. The free tier does not support the backup feature. App service also needs a configured Azure Storage account and blob container as the backup destination. Deployment slots, advisor recommendations, and VM snapshots do not satisfy the requirements for scheduled app service backups. Exam clue. For app service backup questions, check the hosting tier and the backup destination first. Backup is an app service feature stored in a storage container, not a deployment slot or VM snapshot workflow. Question 39. Choose three answers. You deploy a private endpoint for a storage account in a spoke virtual network. Virtual machines in the hub virtual network and in another spoke virtual network must resolve the storage account FQDN to the private endpoint IP address. The VNets are peered. You need to configure name resolution for the private endpoint by using Azure Private DNS. Which three actions should you perform? Option A. Create a public DNS CNAME record that maps the storage account name directly to the private endpoint private IP address. Option B. Create an NSG rule that allows UDP port 53 from the hub subnet to the private endpoint subnet. Option C. Link the private DNS zone to each virtual network whose clients need to resolve the private endpoint name. Option D. Enable gateway transit on the hub to spoke peering so Azure private DNS records are replicated across peered VNets automatically. Option E. Create or associate the private endpoint DNS zone group so an A record for the private endpoint is present in the private DNS zone. Option F. Create the appropriate Azure private DNS zone for the storage private endpoint, such as privatelink_low.core.windows.net for blob storage. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are C, E, F. C, E, and F. Private endpoint name resolution relies on the correct private link Azure private DNS zone for the target service, an A record that maps the service name to the private endpoint IP address, and virtual network links from that zone to the VNets whose clients must resolve the name. Peering alone does not make a private DNS zone resolvable from every VNet, and gateway transit, public DNS records, or NSG rules do not create the required private DNS mapping. Exam clue. For private endpoint DNS, remember 3 pieces: the service-specific private link zone, the A record/zone group for the endpoint, and VNet links for every network that needs resolution. VNet peering is not DNS zone linking. Question 40. Select the best answer. You manage a fleet of Azure virtual machines. Operations wants to review CPU, memory, disk, and network performance trends across the VMs over time, and identify which machines are consuming the most resources. The requirement is trend visualization and performance analysis, not immediate notification when a threshold is crossed. What should you configure? Option A. Run an ad hoc log analytics query only when a user reports a problem. Option B. Create a metric alert rule for CPU percentage with an action group. Option C. Enable Azure Monitor VM Insights for the virtual machines and use the performance views/workbooks to analyze trends. Option D. Enable boot diagnostics on each VM and review the serial console screenshots. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Enable Azure Monitor VM Insights for the virtual machines and use the performance views/workbooks to analyze trends. VM Insights is the Azure Monitor experience designed for monitoring virtual machine performance and dependencies at scale. It provides performance views and workbooks for CPU, memory, disk, and network data so operators can compare machines and analyze trends over time. Metric alerts are appropriate when you need threshold-based notifications, while ad hoc log queries and boot diagnostics do not provide the same purpose-built fleet performance trend visualization. Exam clue. Trend analysis across VMs points to VM Insights. Threshold notification points to metric alerts. One-off investigation points to log queries. Boot diagnostics points to startup console troubleshooting. Question 41. Build list. Your organization has a new workload subscription that must be onboarded into an existing governed landing zone. The subscription must inherit the correct governance controls, comply with required tagging standards, allow the workload operations team to manage resources with least privilege, and notify the finance team when monthly spending approaches the approved limit. In which order should you perform the actions? Choice A. Assign least privilege Azure RBAC roles to the workload operations team at the subscription or resource group scope. Choice B. Create an Azure cost management budget for the subscription with alerts for the finance team. Choice C. Move or place the workload subscription under the correct management group in the landing zone hierarchy. Choice D. Apply or remediate the required subscription resource tags for ownership, environment, and cost tracking. Choice E. Assign the required Azure Policy initiative at the management group or subscription scope to enforce landing zone standards. Put the steps in the correct order before the reveal. The correct order is C, E, D, A, B. A governed landing zone onboarding flow starts by placing the subscription in the correct management group so it can inherit the intended governance boundary. Next, assign or inherit the Azure Policy initiative that enforces standards such as allowed locations, SKUs, and required tags. Then, remediate or apply the required tags so the subscription and workload resources comply with governance and cost tracking standards. After the governance baseline is in place, assign least privilege R back to the workload operations team at the narrowest practical scope. Finally, configure the cost management budget and alerts for finance. Assigning RBAC or budgets before the subscription is in the governed scope can miss inherited policies and standards. Exam clue. For landing zone governance, think hierarchy first. Management group placement, policy inheritance enforcement, tagging compliance, RBAC delegation, budget alerts. Question 42. Matching. You administer Azure Storage for several workloads. Match each requirement to the most appropriate Azure Storage feature or tool. Requirement 1. Use a customer-managed key from Azure Key Vault for Azure Storage encryption at rest. Requirement 2. Automatically copy block blobs from one storage account container to another storage account after changes occur. Requirement 3. Copy large numbers of blobs between storage accounts from the command line with resumable, high-performance transfers. Requirement 4. Recover a blob that was accidentally deleted without restoring the whole storage account. Requirement 5. Maintain previous versions of blobs so an earlier version can be restored after unwanted overwrites. Option A. Blob soft delete. Option B. AZ copy. Option C. Object replication for block blobs. Option D. Customer-managed keys for Azure Storage encryption. Option E. Blob versioning. Match each requirement to the best Azure Storage feature or tool. Each option may be used once. Choose each match before the reveal. The correct matches are 1D, 2C, 3B, 4A, 5E. Requirement 1 matches option D, Customer-Managed Keys for Azure Storage Encryption. Requirement 2 matches option C, Object Replication for Block Blobs. Requirement 3 matches option B, As Copy. Requirement 4 matches option A, Blob Soft Delete. Requirement 5 matches option E, Blob Versioning. Customer-managed keys let an organization control Azure Storage encryption at rest keys using Azure Key Vault or Managed HSM. Object replication is the storage feature for asynchronous block blob replication from a source container to a destination container. As Copy is the command line transfer utility for high-performance blob copy and synchronization scenarios. Blob Soft Delete retains deleted blobs so accidental deletions can be recovered during the retention period. Blob Versioning preserves prior blob versions so an earlier version can be restored after unwanted changes or overwrites. Exam clue: separate the requirement type. Key control, customer-managed keys. Cross-account block blob copy after changes, object replication. Command line bulk transfer, as copy. Deleted blob recovery, soft delete. Overwritten blob recovery, versioning. Question 43. Matching. You need to choose Azure Compute Services for several workload requirements. Match each requirement to the most appropriate deployment target. Requirement 1. Run a traditional Windows Server workload that requires full operating system control and custom agents. Requirement 2. Run a fleet of identical virtual machines behind load balancing with autoscale based on demand. Requirement 3. Start a single container quickly for a short-running task without managing servers or an orchestrator. Requirement 4. Run a containerized microservice that can scale based on HTTP traffic or events in a managed serverless container environment. Requirement 5. Host a managed web application with built-in deployment slots, custom domains, TLS, and platform-managed patching. Option A. Azure Container Apps. Option B. Azure Virtual Machine. Option C. Azure App Service. Option D. Azure Container Instances. Option E. Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets. Match each workload requirement to the most appropriate Azure Compute Service. Each option may be used once. Choose each match before the reveal. The correct matches are 1B, 2E, 3D, 4A, 5C. Requirement 1 matches option B, Azure Virtual Machine. Requirement 2 matches option E, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets. Requirement 3 matches option D, Azure Container Instances. Requirement 4 matches option A, Azure Container Apps. Requirement 5 matches option C, Azure App Service. Azure virtual machines are the best fit when a workload needs full operating system control. Virtual machine scale sets provide a managed group of identical VMs for autoscaled fleet scenarios behind load balancing. Azure Container Instances is the lightweight option for quickly running individual containers without managing servers or orchestration. Azure Container Apps is designed for managed containerized microservices and event-driven apps that scale based on HTTP traffic or events. Azure App Service is the managed PaaS web application platform with deployment slots, custom domains, TLS, and platform-managed patching. Exam clue: match by control and scaling model, full OS control, VM, identical autoscaled VM fleet, VMSS, quick one-off container, ACI, serverless or event-scaled microservice container, Container Apps, managed web app platform features, App Service. Question 44. Select the best answer. You host a public web application behind an Azure public load balancer. The application must be reachable from the internet by using the name app.contoso.com. The public IP address of the load balancer can change if the resource is recreated, and you want DNS to track the Azure public IP resource instead of manually updating an IP address. You manage the contoso.com public DNS zone in Azure DNS. What should you create? Option A. Create a CNAME record named app in a private DNS zone that points to the load balancer private IP address. Option B. Create an alias A record named app in the contoso.com public DNS zone that points to the Azure public IP resource. Option C. Create a standard A record named app with the current numeric public IP address of the load balancer. Option D. Create an NS record named app that delegates app.contoso.com to the load balancer. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is B. Create an alias A record named app in the contoso.com public DNS zone that points to the Azure public IP resource. Azure DNS public zones host internet resolvable records for names such as app.contoso.com. For a public load balancer frontend that uses an Azure public IP resource, an alias A record can target the Azure public IP resource. This preserves A record semantics for the hostname while allowing Azure DNS to track the resource target instead of relying on a manually maintained numeric IP address. A private DNS zone would not satisfy public internet resolution. A normal A record would not track the Azure resource if recreated, and an NS record is for delegation rather than application endpoint resolution. Exam clue: public app name means public DNS zone. If the target is an Azure public IP resource and you want the record to follow the resource, choose an alias A record. Use CNAME for another DNS name, not a direct public IP resource target. Question 45. Choose two answers. Your organization protects Azure virtual machines by using Azure Backup. The compliance team needs historical reporting that shows backup job status, protected items, and backup storage usage across vaults. The operations team also needs automatic notification when backup jobs fail. Which two actions should you perform? Option A. Configure backup reports by sending Azure Backup diagnostic data from the vaults to a log analytics workspace. Option B. Configure Azure Monitor alerts for Azure Backup failure conditions and route notifications to an action group. Option C. Enable boot diagnostics on each protected VM so Azure Backup can report job status from VM screenshots. Option D. Create an Azure Advisor recommendation workbook for the Recovery Services vaults. Option E. Perform a manual restore test each month and email the result to the compliance team instead of configuring reporting. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are A, B. A and B. Azure Backup Reporting is built on diagnostic data sent to Azure Monitor logs in a log analytics workspace, enabling historical reporting across vaults for jobs, protected items, and storage usage. Azure Monitor Alerting for Azure Backup provides automatic notification paths, typically through action groups, when backup failures or other alert conditions occur. Advisor, manual restore tests, and boot diagnostics do not replace centralized backup reports or automated backup failure alerting. Exam clue: split the requirement. Compliance history and trend evidence points to backup reports/log analytics. Automatic failure notification points to Azure Monitor alerts and action groups. Question 46. Select the best answer. A user is assigned the contributor role at the subscription scope. A resource group in the subscription contains a storage account. The resource group has a reluctance resource lock. The user tries to update the storage account configuration. What happens? Option A. The update is blocked because the read-line lock prevents write operations, even though RBAC grants contributor permissions. Option B. The update is blocked only if the user lacks the User Access Administrator role at the resource group scope. Option C. The update succeeds, but the user cannot delete the storage account because read-only locks only block delete operations. Option D. The update succeeds because contributor inherited from the subscription overrides any resource locks on child scopes. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A. The update is blocked because the rewrite lock prevents write operations, even though RBAC grants contributor permissions. Azure RBAC determines what actions a principal is allowed to perform, and a contributor assignment inherited from the subscription would normally allow management operations on resources in the subscription. However, Azure resource locks apply at the scope where they are assigned and to child resources. A read-light prevents write and delete operations, so it blocks updating the storage account even when RBAC would otherwise allow the operation. This differs from a cannot delete lock, which allows updates but prevents deletion. Exam clue: evaluate both layers. RBAC grants allowed actions, but locks can still block write-delete operations. Relight blocks updates. Cannot delete blocks deletion only. Question 47. Select the best answer. You need to copy all blobs from one storage account container to a container in another storage account. The transfer must be repeatable from an automation script, include virtual directories recursively, and avoid using storage account keys. The automation identity can be granted Azure RBAC data plane permissions on both containers. Which tool and authentication approach should you use? Option A. Use Azure Advisor to generate a transfer recommendation and then approve the recommendation. Option B. Use the Azure portal to download the blobs locally and upload them to the destination container. Option C. Use AZ copy with Microsoft Entra authentication/RBAC and a recursive copy command between the source and destination container URLs. Option D. Use Azure Storage Explorer interactively with the storage account keys for both accounts. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Use AZ copy with Microsoft Entra authentication RBAC and a recursive copy command between the source and destination container URLs. AZ copy is the command line utility intended for high-performance Azure storage copy operations and is appropriate for repeatable automation scripts. It supports recursive copy behavior for blob virtual directories and can authenticate with Microsoft Entra ID so access can be governed by Azure RBAC data plane roles rather than broad storage account keys. Storage Explorer and the Azure portal are primarily interactive experiences, and Advisor does not transfer data. Exam clue: scripted bulk transfer points to AZ copy. GUI management points to Storage Explorer. Avoiding account keys points to Microsoft Entra RBAC data plane authorization. Question 48. Choose 3 answers. You deploy an Azure App Service web app. The app must be reachable at https:// www.contoso.com by using a trusted certificate. Only requests from your company public IP ranges should be allowed to reach the app. The app must also connect outbound to resources in an Azure virtual network. Which 3 configurations should you use? Option A. Create a private endpoint for the app service app and remove the public DNS record for www.contoso.com. Option B. Configure regional virtual network integration for the app service app. Option C. Configure a CORS rule that allows only the company website origins. Option D. Assign a managed identity to the app and grant it reader on the virtual network. Option E. Configure app service access restrictions to allow the company public IP ranges and deny other inbound traffic. Option F. Add and validate the custom domain name for www.contoso.com and bind a trusted TLS and SSL certificate to that hostname. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answers are B, E, F. B, E, and F. This scenario has 3 required app service configuration areas. First, the custom domain must be added and validated, and a trusted TLS certificate must be bound so the app can serve https://www.contoso.com. Second, app service access restrictions should allow the company public IP ranges and deny other inbound traffic. Third, regional virtual network integration provides outbound connectivity from the app service app to resources in an Azure virtual network. A private endpoint is for private inbound access and would not replace the stated public custom domain access pattern. CORS is not network access control. And a managed identity role assignment on the VNet does not create network connectivity. Exam clue. Break app service networking into directions and layers. Custom domain/DNS plus TLS for the public name. Access restrictions for inbound filtering by public IP. And VNet integration for outbound access to VNet resources. Question 49. Select yes if the proposed solution meets the goal. Otherwise, select no. You have a hub virtual network and a spoke virtual network connected by virtual network peering. A network virtual appliance, NVA, is deployed in the hub virtual network and is configured to forward IP traffic. The spoke contains a workload subnet. You need internet-bound traffic from the workload subnet to be inspected by the NVA without breaking the return path from the NVA back to the spoke workloads. Proposed solution. Enable forwarded traffic on the hub-spoke peering. Associate a route table to the workload subnet and add a route for 0.0.0.0/0 with next hop type virtual appliance and the next hop address set to the NVA private IP address. Does this meet the goal? Option A, yes. Option B, no. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is A, yes. A user-defined route can override the default system route for the workload subnet. Setting 0.0.0.0/0 to next hop type virtual appliance with the NVA private IP makes internet-bound traffic from that subnet go to the NVA for inspection. Because the NVA is in a peered hub virtual network and the traffic is forwarded rather than originated by the NVA subnet itself, the peering must allow forwarded traffic. With the NVA configured for IP forwarding and proper routing/NAT behavior, Azure has the system routes needed for the NVA to return traffic to the spoke address space over the peering, avoiding an asymmetric path caused by sending only one direction through the appliance. Exam clue. For NVA force tunneling, look for 3 pieces: UDR on the source subnet, next hop type virtual appliance with the NVA private IP, and peering/VM settings that permit forwarding. Gateway transit and DNS records are different problems. Question 50. Select the best answer. You protect several Azure virtual machines by using Azure Site Recovery. You need to validate the disaster recovery process for the application without affecting the production virtual machines or committing to a failover. You also need to remove the temporary test resources after validation. What should you do? Option A. Run a planned failover during business hours and skip reprotection so that production remains unchanged. Option B. Run an unplanned failover to the recovery region and commit the failover after the machine starts successfully. Option C. Disable replication for the protected virtual machines. Start copies manually in the target region and delete the copies after testing. Option D. Run a test failover for the replicated machines or recovery plan to an isolated test virtual network. Validate the application, and then run cleanup test failover. Choose your answer before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Run a test failover for the replicated machines or recovery plan to an isolated test virtual network. Validate the application, and then run cleanup test failover. Azure Site Recovery Test Failover is designed for disaster recovery drills. It starts test virtual machines in Azure without affecting the production machines or requiring a committed failover. Choosing an isolated test virtual network avoids network conflicts with production. After validation, cleanup test failover removes the temporary test resources and records the drill as complete. Planned and unplanned failovers are real failover operations, and disabling replication would reduce protection rather than validate it safely. Exam clue. For a DR drill that must not affect production, choose test failover. For a real move during a controlled event, choose planned failover. For outage recovery, choose unplanned failover. After a DR drill, run cleanup test failover. Confidence builder. If some questions felt hard, that is the point. Every miss is a map. Which Azure service to review, which scope to check, and which distractor to avoid next time. Replay the weak topics, review the exam clues, and come back stronger for the next pass. Thanks for watching WebLizard CertLab. If this practice exam helped, keep going with the next review session, and use the answer explanations as your Azure Administrator study checklist.